I'm Dan Suarez of Suarez Family Brewery, and this is the Brewer to Brewer podcast from All About Beer. My guest today is Matthias Trum of Schlenkerla, and he is here for a conversation that goes beyond the brewhouse and into topics that matter to brewing professionals and curious beer drinkers. First, please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media at allaboutbeer. And to support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We'll get into the conversation in just a moment, but first, this message.
First Tea is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Falling temps and festive seasons are fast approaching, which means now is a good time to develop holiday stouts and brown ales using hibiscus and cinnamon from First Tea. Looking for other new ideas? You can find out more about First Tea's collaborations with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttea.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog. Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malteurop Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropmaltingco.com to learn how Malteurop Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malteurop Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurop.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order.
All right, let's get into it. A bit about my guest today. Matthias Trum is the sixth generation owner and brewmaster of Schlenkerla. He grew up and still lives today in the historic building that houses the brewery's historic tavern in Bamberg, Germany. He has studied both business and brewing science and majored in the history of brewing. Matthias became responsible for the brewery and the pub in 2003 and has focused on the conversation and the rediscovery of historic brewing and malting styles. He hopes that one day one of his children will continue the long Schlenkerla family tradition. Welcome, Matthias. How are you?
And thank you for having me on the show and for inviting me onto this interview.
No problem.
And thank you for the resume. I think we're already done with the contents of the show then.
Well, actually, the end of that bio is, I think, is probably or where I'm most curious. He hopes to one day that his children will continue the long Schlenkerla family tradition. Obviously, Schlenkerla is a throwback kind of brewery, but it's also a brewery with heritage and family heritage, and even the beer style of Rauchbier has a nice heritage. And I guess I wanted to start today on what does family brewing mean to you, and if you could weave in any stories from your childhood or stories passed down through the generations, or old brewing records or anything like that. Yeah, what is family brewing to you?
Family brewing is well, first of all, a very personal matter, of course. When you come to the Schlenkerla Tavern and the main room, the so-called Altes Lokal, there's my line of ancestors on the wall, pictures, things you normally only know from, when you go to castles and you have these line of kings and barons and so forth. We have that with the brewers. So there's my great-great-grandfather up there, my grandfather, and so forth. And it gives you a sense of purpose because you're part of something bigger, and you can continue something which has been there for a very long time, and you can pass on the flame to the next generation. That really is the idea, and of course the flame plays an important role in smoked beer, but we can talk about that more later on.
Yeah.
So it gives you, I don't want to make it sound too big and too large, but it gives you some form of closure. For instance, with all the crises that we're having at the moment and that we're facing, and also the crises of the past, like when Lehman Brothers collapsed and a lot of breweries or businesses thought, oh my God, how is that going to end? How I get money and so forth. I always have something from the family history I can look into where I say, hey, what we're facing now is peanuts compared to what they had to face back then, and they found a way. And that gives you some reassurance that no matter what, Schlenkerla is going to be there and the family business is going to continue. For instance, at the end of World War II, obviously my grandfather was drafted to the military and for 6 years couldn't be in the brewery. So my grandmother was running the business. And both customers and brewers were more or less gone because they were, of course, in the military, and it was extremely dire times. The Nazis basically prevented beer from being brewed the regular way because everything became scarce towards the end of the war, like no barley, nothing of that sort. And they were only allowed to brew thin beer with like 2% original gravity, which is nothing really.
Yeah.
And in all that time, the tavern always still stayed open. And in the last weeks before the war ended, they were serving food against food stamps.
Yeah.
So they were part of the community service, and there was no doubt whatsoever that it's going to continue in some form. And this is really a thing which reassures one, and it helps you, especially in dire times, which I think we're having in some form at the moment, though
Yeah.
it's all about money at the moment, inflation and
Yeah.
raw material costs. It's horrible for all the breweries, but compared to what they were facing back then, yeah, it's
Yeah.
handleable.
Yeah. So like any either stories or records that kind of inform like your philosophy or how you do things at Schlenkerla today? Like can you go into depth of anything like that?
Well, I don't know how many of the listeners or whether you have ever been to the Schlenkerla Tavern, but when
Yes.
you enter it, it's a little bit like a time travel. Everything looks as it looked centuries ago. You have these big wooden beams on the ceiling, or in one of the rooms you have a Gothic arched ceiling which almost looks like a cathedral, and in fact it was a church at one point, a chapel to
Yeah.
be exact. And the entire complex breathes history and past, and so does the beer. Smoke beer is a historic beer style which was preserved at Schlenkerla, and so this always played a very important role in the family history. My grandmother was a very conservative person, my great grandfather, and when I look into history, what happened at what point, I think it very often was a deliberate family decision to continue the historic way and not engage into new things. For instance, in the 1920s, which was after World War One, the big hyperinflation in Germany, my great grandfather, he got a contract for the local train station to supply them with beer, which was a very happy occasion because you were happy about any beer you could sell. And they took the smoke beer, of course, but they also wanted a lager beer. So he actually introduced the lager beer, but he kept it smoky in a certain way by fermenting it with a yeast which was in the smoke beer before. So he, even at that extremely difficult situation, he did not leave totally the original roots. And in fact, Michael was the one who kind of stood against the trend, which was to abolish smoke beers and to go
Yes.
into normal brewing. So the family plays a very, very important role in that respect. And um, I think in a way, it helps you to see that your ancestors did it that because it gives you an orientation, a sense of orientation where you're going to. And I think you need a special type of person who does that because normally an entrepreneur wants to, start something new and create it from scratch. And in the United States,
Grow,
very
grow,
often
grow.
it's grow, exactly, grow, and sell out one day. And
Yeah.
I mean, who was that? One American brewer he never wanted to sell, and he sold in the end. And anyways, Koch, was that him?
Yeah,
Or
yeah, Stone.
So that's the thing. That's the spirit which a lot of entrepreneurs have. And in Schlenkela, that never was an issue. For us, it always was about preservation, keeping the place as it is. Of course, you have certain variances in the size depending on the era you're in,
Yeah.
but there's no idea, no intention to grow it into a huge business or sell it out for that matter. I mean, we've had our offers over time where people wanted to
Yeah.
take us over, obviously, but that's never been an issue, and profit maximization has never been an issue. I
Yeah.
mean, you said early on from my personal bio that I studied business science, so I have all
Mhm.
that background and I have the toolbox to do it that way, but I just refuse to do because it's not what Schlenkela is about. And one example, 2010 in Germany, or in Bavaria for that matter. Germany is split up into several federal states, similar to the
Yeah.
United States,
Yep.
and each state has certain freedom to make their own rules. So Bavaria decided in 2010, through a popular vote actually, that all public buildings, including taverns, are going to be smoke-free. So total smoking ban there.
Yeah.
A lot of taverns were a little bit, well, anxious or uneasy about that because they didn't know how customers would react and how what would happen there. And for me, the thing was, I'm personally not a smoker at all,
Yeah.
so I did not have a personal effect of that. But for me, this was a chance to renovate the chapel within the tavern, the Dominikaner Klause, which has
Mhm.
this beautiful painting on the ceiling, but 80 years of cigarette smoke and tar had pretty much covered it.
Covered. Yeah. Wow.
And you could only have a faint idea of what it originally looked like. So I got in contact with a church restoration company who usually does these, gold leaf paintings, what
Wow.
you do in churches. And they were in there in the room for like roughly 3 months. So we closed down that one room for 3 months, and they had these really tiny, tiny pencils, and they washed it off with little squids and with little sponges, and they took off all this tar. And I have before and after pictures. It's just amazing what it looks like.
Wow.
Um, Not so amazing was the invoice I got after all that
Yeah.
process, and I was
Yeah.
like, "Oop, yuck, that was quite hefty." But when I look at other entrepreneurs which enjoy their Porsche, or whatever kind of money you can spend on stuff, we
Yeah.
invested it there. And every day I go in there, and I'm pretty much every day in that room, I look up at the
Yes.
ceiling and I'm happy about it again.
Yeah.
And you know what? If I would have bought a big car back then, that would be pretty much broken by now, 13 years later, and the
Yeah.
ceiling is still there.
Yeah.
So it's a much more
Wow.
long time investment, which I personally enjoy, and I hope that a few of the customers at least enjoy it there. When they drink and raise their head while drinking, and then they can see all the pictures and stuff up there.
Yeah.
So that's really what the family is about, and I think my ancestors did it the same way. My father always conveys it to me like that. He's 83 years now. And we talk basically every day, and he always encourages me to keep doing it like that and make everything nice and
Yeah.
historically correct, and invest the money into the business, even if in the end the profit margin compared to the invested capital is not what it could be if we did it the most professional way. But we have a little artifact there. So
Yeah.
that's really the idea behind it.
Yeah. And so I guess extrapolating on that, like, was it your great grandfather who like decided to hold on to smoke beer as other breweries were modernizing?
Yeah,
Um,
Michael Grasser.
yeah. So like, are there any stories of like, was that obviously there's probably difficulties that came along with that, and or like trying to figure out how to make money and also preserve the history? um and maybe sometimes there was like some benefits to that, like you could say like we are a traditional brewery. Like, are there any stories like that?
Well, I think you have to start a little bit earlier and look at who
Okay.
Michael was. Michael had 13 siblings. A few of them died at a relatively young age, which was the common thing late 1900s. So he was
Yes.
born, oh my God, 1868, I think. And he actually wanted to become a how to say that an art historian, and he wanted
Mhm.
to go to university and study. So that was his aim.
Mhm.
But when his father died at a relatively young age, he had to take over the company because he was the smart one and the oldest one of the family.
Okay, yeah.
But he brought a lot of his art understanding into the tavern. So when you go to Schlenkela and you look at how it's refurbished inside, the
Yeah.
historic paintings on the wall, the old chandeliers, that's all Michael's doing.
Yeah.
At a time when the normal Franconian brewer would be somebody in rubber boots running through his brewery and be entangled in the middle of the works. Michael went to Italy to auctions and got old depictions of Bamberg because
Wow.
in Germany and Bamberg at the time it wasn't important. I mean, nowadays a lot of people collect antiques, but he
Yeah.
was like at least one generation ahead of the rest of them.
Wow.
And then World War One came and he was at the front, so it stole him 6 years of what he could have done at Schleinkela. But when the war was over, he immediately took off again, and he actually rented that old chapel, which where I was renovating the ceiling,
Hmm.
and he renovated it for the first time. He
Hmm.
got the conservator of the National German Museum of Nuremberg to do that. Because before that time it was used as a military installation, and as you can imagine, they didn't pay much focus
Yeah.
onto beautiful ceilings and
No.
stuff like that. So he brought a lot of his ideas into the Schleinkela and ran it his way, and it paid off in a way that even then there were newspaper articles on this unique tavern and how Michael would run it. And I think he already was a little bit of an icon of the time because he
Oh,
was so different from all the other brewers.
interesting.
And uh, the the decision to continue the smoke beer is, of course, the most important one, but it's
Yeah.
just one of the aspects. He continued, for instance, also the historic rock cellars, which we're still using underneath the brewery.
Yes.
Um, 20s were the time like artificial cooling was invented in 1872 by Carl von Linde, but in the 1920s or so it became uh, how to say
Normal. No.
available everywhere,
Yeah.
normal. Yeah,
Yeah.
all the breweries would close down their rock cellars because it was simply easier to lager the beer next to the brewery rather than to transport it throughout the city and bring it to the rock cellars. Like
Yeah.
when you look at Bamberg, the setting is the breweries were spread out all over the city, but
Yeah.
the rock cellars were on the hills. So you would have to transport the beer after the brewing process for fermentation and lagering to the rock cellars, and after that back to the tavern for pouring it.
Yeah.
And of course, it made sense to forego all that effort and do it in one location. And Michael said, nah, we're not going to do that. We keep the rock cellar in operation. And he actually made the opposite decision, and he moved the brewery to the rock cellars. So the brewery used to be where the tavern is today in the back
Ah,
building.
I didn't realize
And
that.
and also the malting. So that's
Yeah. Wow.
the starting point of Schlenkela dating back to 1405. And Michael moved the brewery up on the hill to enable him to keep the rock cellars in operation. So today we're profiting from that. I'm profiting from that because we still have the historic setup with a copper brewer house and the rock cellars underneath. And of course, we have more space in the tavern, which
Yeah.
brings all kinds of advantages. So
Yeah.
coming back to your original question, I think Michael made a lot of decisions out of um, a sense of beauty, wanting to make things nice looking and historically coherent and
Yeah.
art, like full of art, not
Yeah.
artificial, but full of art.
Yes.
And it turned out later that these were very good business decisions as well, because we
Mm.
have more capacity these days. We can like not produce in a modern style very efficiently, but if we were just in the brewery, it would be just a brew pub these days. We couldn't supply supermarkets, we couldn't export
Yeah.
to the United States,
Yeah.
and it would be just in quotation mark the tavern. So
Yeah.
out of that. sense of beauty, he made that decision, which had economic consequence.
Wow, cool. You mentioned the caves. I was lucky enough on one of my trips to Bamberg to get a tour with Andreas at of the cave, and amazing experience, hand dug. You can still see the little chisel marks and everything. And I was wondering if just to hear more about the history of caves in Bavaria or Franconia, and the history of your specific cave, like who was it built, who built it, when, and just some comments on the caves.
Um, they actually go back very, very far. I mean, I had a historian research the premises of the brewery location up on the hill, and the oldest record is actually from 1387.
Wow.
And already at the time, it was owned by a brewer. Eberleinbräu was his name. At the time, usually the profession was your last name. And it that document from back then doesn't say anything about the caves. So we can't be 100% sure that the caves actually were there. But in my opinion, why would a brewer own that premise if not for using the caves for lagering the beer? And very often when you read, I'm making the big circle now.
Yeah.
Very often when you read on the history of lager beers, people will write that lager beer only started in the 19th century with the Pilsner beer and Carlsberg and et cetera, et cetera. In my opinion, that's false. I think lager beers have been around for a much longer time. When I did my diploma thesis in Weinstefan, I wrote that on a particular aspect of brewing history, the depiction of brewmasters. And a very important and the oldest depiction of a brewmaster is from the city of Nuremberg from 1425. So I was researching in the city archives in Nuremberg the background of that depiction and so forth. And I found that even back then in the 15th century, this is before Columbus discovered the Americas, Nuremberg had something which they called cold beer, which was served in the summertime. In fact, there was a trial between breweries or brewers that owned rock cellars and those who didn't. And those who didn't sued the ones with the rock cellars for serving cold beer in the summertime because it was seen as the higher quality beer.
Yeah.
So you can be pretty sure that back then lager beer was common, and all the old records show that the brewing was different back then here in the area. Brewers would brew only in the wintertime, meaning lager beers when the outside temperature was okay, brought that to the caves and kept it in the caves all the time till summer and continuously served from there. And only towards the end of summer, when the beer ran out, they were brewing top fermented beer, which was called winter beer for a short period of time. And that was very much a Bavarian thing. I found an old book from Baden-Württemberg, which is over Stuttgart area where Mercedes-Benz, for instance, comes from. And in that, they're writing about Bavarian brewers, and they say, if you're a brewer in Bavaria, you're not brewing all year round like here in Baden-Württemberg. You only brew in the wintertime. And in the summertime, you have to do all kinds of other works in the brewery, like paint the walls and stuff like that. So you learn all kinds of things besides brewing. So this must have been a particular thing in Bavaria. And if you think of the Nockerberg event in Munich, the big bock beer tapping they do from the Paulaner Brewery I think in March it is usually. They also have rock cellars there. So I think wherever there's rock cellars, there's bottom fermenting beer at least for the last 500 years. And that's why these rock cellars are so important for the brewing history. And as you said, they were dug out manually. I don't know whether there was some natural rock to start with, and then they a natural cave to start with, and then they expanded from there.
Hmm.
I don't have any records on that, but there's a lot of records from the 17th and 1800s when all these rock cellars were extended and enlarged. And basically, the Stephansberg, the Mount Stephan here in Bamberg,
Yeah.
which is now inside the city and has a lot of houses and stuff and
Yeah.
so forth. It's like a maze underneath, and
Wow.
it's gotten to a point early last century where there actually was a ban to further enlarge the rock cellars because they had stability problems on
Yeah.
top, because they
Yes.
were
The foundations,
various.
the foundations were gonna crumble or whatever.
Exactly. I think in the 1960s or so, a car broke in the street into one of the rock cellars.
Oh my
So
God.
then, then they started because by the time the Schlenkerla cellar was the last one to be used, and all the other ones were empty. So they started lining those other ones with concrete on the inside in order to
Yeah.
stabilize them. So
Oh,
nowadays the Schlenkerla rock cellars are really the last ones which are in the original state, and they still have beer down there. So again, an amazing thing. And the other thing which I find very intriguing, and I think some more research should be done along that way. Um, as all the listeners probably know, there's a lot of debate on where the original lager yeast comes from. And there's these ideas that it's out of Georgia or maybe grew in the mountains or something. But when you look at at this really long lager beer history here in Franconia and also in Bohemia, Franconia and Bohemia are one cultural circle. And if it wouldn't have been for World War II and communism, um, there would have never been much separation between the two. The beers are similar, the food is similar, housing is similar. From here to Prague, it's much shorter than from here to, say, Hamburg or Berlin.
hmm.
Yeah, so that it's one cultural background. And I think if we were to research more, I wouldn't be surprised if we find out that the historic lager beer yeast comes from somewhere here in the area, because um, all over the planet, the optimal temperature for lager beer fermentation is 7 to 8 degrees Celsius. And that's the natural temperature in the rock cellars here. That can't be a coincidence.
Yeah.
That there must be a connection over breeding over centuries and so forth. Because as you know, in the old days, brewers would harvest the yeast from a previous batch and add it to the next batch. And when you do that continuously over time in those historic rock cellars, you basically have a breeding program for
Yeah.
bottom fermenting yeast at 8 degrees Celsius.
Natural selection.
Yeah. I
Um,
have I have a brewing protocol book from my great grandfather, from Konrad
whoa.
Graser. He was, before he took over Schlenkerla and Heller, like he wasn't born into here, he took it over. He was the patron at the oldest brewery of Bamberg, the St. Michaelsberg Brewery. St. Michaelsberg Monastery was founded in the 11th century, and they had a brewery from the start. So it's the same range as the Weinstephaner Brewery, who always claims to be the oldest brewery in the world. Though the document that proves that is a forgery from the 16th century. So that's known. So always be careful with dates on labels. That's
Yeah.
just a tip I give you. Okay, so St. Michaelsberg Brewery dates back to 11th century, and my great grandfather was running it as a patron because at the time the monastery was closed and the brewery was basically leased out to commercial brewers, and he had run it from 1840 to 1865. And when my grandmother died a couple of years ago, age 104, beer conserves. So beer is a natural preservative. I found like a treasure chest from her with all kinds of documents on old brewing and stuff. And there was this brewing protocol book from Conrad in there. And what he did was he started in 1840 and wrote down every batch of beer he made until 1855.
Wow.
1854, sorry. So it's a couple of hundreds of beer recipes, if you will. He has water amount in there, barley amount, what hops did he use, how did the fermentation go, at what temperature did he ferment? It was all bottom fermented beer.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
also what
Fermented at 8 degrees Celsius in the cellars. Or I mean,
no,
no.
no, because
Okay.
at the time the
Oh, there was
Celsius
no cellar.
scale,
Oh yeah.
there, no, the cellar was
Oh,
there. He
yeah.
had the St. Michaelberg also has cellars,
Oh,
but at the time the Celsius scale didn't
no
exist.
Celsius. Yes.
At the time the scale was Reaumur, and
Yeah.
in Reaumur 0 degrees freezing, like in Celsius,
Hmm.
but 80 degrees is boiling. So it's
Okay.
scaled down a bit. So he was lagering, fermenting at 6 degrees Reaumur,
Okay.
which
Cold.
translate to 8 degrees Celsius,
Yeah.
same temperature. And
Cool.
he often writes about giving base to a beer. So I don't know how to say that in English. In German, it's in the old German they called it "Ich gab Grund." I
Hmm.
gave base or I gave reason to a beer.
Hmm.
And in the brewer's term, that meant give yeast to start the fermentation.
Ah,
And
yes.
he always says with what batch of beer he gave base. So this was
Yeah.
a continuous process. He took
Wow.
the leftover yeast, whatever had settled at the base of the previous barrels, and he restarted the fermentation
Yeah.
like that. And keep in mind that in the summertime they were not brewing. So in
Yes.
September they had to start with one of the batches which were brewed at most in March.
Wow. Oh, that is very interesting. Yeah, so that's still like months in between
Right,
harvesting or back pitching or whatever.
right.
So what, I mean, I'm sure there was flavor descriptors in there, like notes on batches if they went well or whatnot. And when were the best batches and what was said about them?
Well, the flavor notes are not as extensive as I would like them.
Yeah, yeah,
And he basically concentrates on the batches that didn't ferment too well.
yeah,
And sometimes he says is a good fermentation. And I can't really make out a system to when a batch went well or not. I think it has a lot to do with hygiene, which of course was a big problem at the time because you did not have the micro bacteria background. I mean, Pasteur came later,
yes,
and of course, no stainless steel, all wooden
yeah,
barrels and so forth, and wooden mashing tuns. So
yeah,
the normal system was that you had a wooden mashing box, not a ton actually,
yeah,
wooden mashing box, and then you had a copper brewing kettle with which you were brewing continuously. Like they lathered a couple of times and had 2 or 3 different batches from the lautherings, which they then blended to various beers. And I think they often had a problem with infection and
yeah.
had to use the beer quickly. And so the beers for the summertime were always brewed a little bit stronger,
Ah,
and
interesting.
in order to bring the alcohol to a higher level.
Yeah.
And also the hops amount were much greater than we would use them today.
Wow.
So I think that was also part of the stabilization because hops, of course, is a bacteriostatic element in beer.
Yeah.
And but he doesn't have, and that's the real interesting thing. He doesn't have a style description. He doesn't say like, okay, today we're brewing a lager, or tomorrow we're brewing a red beer, and so forth. That's totally not mentioned in there. And he doesn't say anything about malt. He says he used so and so much malt, yes, but it's not like brewers would work today where they have a blend of certain malts, like
Yeah.
a Pilsner malt, a red malt, a sour malt, or what
Yeah.
all there is. So back then, a brewer would make one type of malt,
Yeah.
and then the flavor variances came out of the hops. That really was the idea, at
Mm.
least to those brewing records I saw.
Yeah.
And so I think brewing has come a long way since then, in the last 200 years, that is.
Yeah.
And what I also found is, and I needed some other books in order to confirm that, because some of the things were a little bit odd about those recipes. For instance, um, technically they were all bock beers. He used a lot of malt compared to the water, and I have to explain that. Nowadays, you work with liters, with kilograms, or in the United States with gallons, and what Also kilograms or what?
Barrels, pounds,
Pounds,
yeah.
exactly. But it's defined measurements. In those old recipes, that's totally different. Malt was measured in volume rather than weight, and the volume unit back then was Scheffel and Metzen. So the first thing you have to do is to translate that into modern measures, which is difficult because the measures weren't the same in every city. So you have to look where it is, how it was in Bamberg. Then beer was measured in buckets. That was the size. But again, the bucket of Bamberg was a different size than the bucket of Munich, for
Yeah.
instance. And so it goes on and goes on. And I actually needed a historian to help me with that. And it took us like a year to figure out what was going on in these recipes. And in the end, we found out that it's technically Bock beers. And I was like, what was going on? Why would they brewing Bock beers all the time? And it together with other books, I found out that in fact, Bamberg Brewers had two products. One was beer, and the other one was called Heinzlein, which was like a second runnings,
Mhm.
and it was a children's beer. That's why they call it Heinzlein, which means little Heinz. Yeah, so they
Oh,
gave it to the children, but also for the working people, for the hardworking people, and this had less than 1% alcohol. And second runnings from the lauderings. And when you add that into the overall consumption, it makes sense. So basically, they had one batch of malt and they
mhm.
turned it into a little bit more stronger beer, which Bamberg was actually famous for, of having stronger beer than other cities. And the second runnings was the Heinzlein, which was the during the day beer. So you had your,
Yeah.
today I would call this the office beer during the
Yeah.
day. And then
Yeah.
the evening you had the fun beer together with your friends.
Yeah. And the Heinz line was probably a nourishing beer too. Like
No,
no.
no, it was
Oh,
not. It was. I actually restarted the Heinz line 4 years or 3 years
yeah.
ago during Corona. We were bored, so we said, "Hey,
Yeah.
let's do something else." And the Heinz line is now available here in Bamberg in bottles and stuff, and we also serve it in our tavern. And it's 0.9 alcohol, and it's only 10 calories to the 100 milliliters. So it's
Is
about a third or half of the calories that light beers have or alcohol-free beers have.
is it still a second runnings beer?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
It
That's cool.
definitely is. And it's not only second runnings. They did something else with there, which I kind of like to keep as a secret for myself so that we're
Okay.
not being copied that much.
Okay. Cool.
Now, they had
Uh,
a unique new thing about it. And compared with the really low original gravity, we're talking 3 point something original gravity,
yeah.
it has a really rich beer flavor to it because of this thing they did back then. And so it's really a thirst quencher during the day or after sports and that. And after that, you go for the regular beer. But it's the alternative to water because in the 19th century there was no water purification. Water
Yeah.
was potentially polluted, so people would drink beer during the day. But obviously, you cannot drink a regular beer, especially not in Bamberg where the alcohol was higher. So you
Yeah.
would drink Heinzlein. Yeah.
How has that been marketed? Like, has that been popular for you? I know people, at least in the United States, are starting to drink more NA beer, more low alcohol beer. Has that been like a good success so far in the short amount of time you've been brewing it, the Heinz line beers?
It's a local thing. Here in Bamberg, it runs really
Gotcha.
well. We're in basically every supermarket, and a lot of people actually buy it. In the tavern, we do, I don't know, 100 cases a month or so. So it's really okay. Outside Bamberg, it's difficult because you need to tell that story because in Germany, all those beers in that range are actually non-alcoholic beers.
Yeah.
So I think we're pretty much the only low alcohol beer in all of Germany.
Yeah.
And it's I don't know about the States. In Germany, the limit for no alcohol is 0.5.
I think it's the same.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
no alcohol does not mean it doesn't have alcohol. Yeah. It only means it's
Yeah.
below a certain rate.
Yeah.
And because it's 0.9 and not 0.5, it doesn't get that big range because a lot of people instantaneously say, oh, this has alcohol. No, I rather want alcohol free.
Yeah.
Not realizing that they get 0.5 instead of 0.9, which both means low alcohol. So
Yeah.
it's it's a wrong law definition in my point of view. Alcohol free should be 0.0 and
Yeah.
everything else should be low alcohol.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
it's the way they did it.
I mean, I guess this conversation on the Heinz line just jarred my memory. One of the times I came by the Schlenkerla Tavern, you had a seasonal beer on. You had the smoke beer and then the Kreuzen beer.
The summer beer.
Yeah, and it seemed to stand alone. Like it wasn't like any of the other Schlenkerla beers, and I didn't really know how to describe it. Is that brewed differently, or is that the beer that you brewed to Kreuzen all of your other batches with? Like is there a historical context for that?
Schlenkerla, there's always a historical context.
Yes.
And the great thing about Schlenkerla history or about beer history, it's not dry. It's
Yeah.
really a
Yeah.
thirst quencher. Now the Kreuzen in German or in German brewers term, the Kreuzen are the foam bubbles in the main fermentation.
Yeah.
I guess most people know that.
Yeah.
And um, think back about what I was saying early on. People here would brew, or brewers here would brew in the winter time and lager the beer all throughout summer. But obviously, the wooden barrels did not have a pressure fermentation over time, so beers would get more stale over time. And in the summertime, in the end, they were pretty low carbonated, which is also known as cellar beer
Mm-hmm.
here in the
Mm-hmm.
area. But if you wanted to have a vivid beer in the summertime with a lot of carbonation, you had to recarbonate the beer. Nowadays, of course, you can do that artificially with CO2, which you pump into the vessel. But historically, that technology was not available. So what brewers would do back then was brew a new batch and add a little bit of young beer to the already lagered beer to get the fermentation going again, to recarbonate the beer. And in German brewers' term, this is called Aufkreuzen, to bubble it up, to foam it up. That's the literal translation. And a beer which was treated like this could be called and was called the Kreuzen beer. So that's the historic background story to it. The marketing story, which of course always plays a certain role, was
Yes, of
in
course.
it in the summertime. A lot of people at our tavern said, "Well, the Märzen from the wooden barrel is great, but 5.1% alcohol, a dark beer, and 35 degrees." Don't go all that well hand in hand. So we wanted to have an addition to that for the summertime, rather than having everybody drink a water. A water
Yeah.
has been taken the chance of becoming a beer.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a little bit frustrating for brewer to sell in a tavern. So I thought of this historic Kreuzen technique and said, let's take our traditional lager beer, which is only very slightly smoky. Remember the one that Michael Grasso introduced 100 years
Yes.
ago? And we Kreuzen it up with a classic smoke beer. So
Gotcha.
we increase the smokiness and a little bit the color, but the alcohol stays pretty much the same because we only have like 10% or so of the Märzen, which we need to Kreuzen it up. So
Hmm.
we end up with a pale amber,
Yeah.
rather amber lager at about 4.5% alcohol, unfiltered, that is, um, richly carbonated, which is a perfect addition for the
Yeah.
summertime. And I think we
Cool.
started that in 2013 or 14. And the Heinzlein actually came after that. So the Heinzlein is a little bit of a competition for that now in the summertime.
Ah,
Yeah, because
yeah.
obviously at 35 degrees, 4.5% beer, that's okay. But 0.9, hey, that's the beater. Yeah.
Yeah.
So during the day, you see a lot of people drinking Heinzlein. In the evening, they switch over to Kreuzen.
Gotcha.
This was actually, and if you allow me this small
Yes,
anecdote, I mean,
please.
Schlenkerla has a lot of regular customers, people that come in every day, and um, a few or quite a few of them are of the older semester because they've come to Schlenkerla for like decades.
Yeah.
And the most, how to say that, renowned Stammtisch, that's a German word, the table of regulars, is when you
Yeah.
come into the tavern, you turn to the left to the first
Yeah.
room, and you have this beautiful green tile often in there,
Yeah.
and the table right next to it. So
And that's the
when
smallest room too, right? It's like
that's the smallest room too,
yes.
and when you're allowed to sit on that Stammtisch, then you made it. Then you achieved everything you need to
Um,
achieve in life.
yeah,
No,
okay. Well,
there. They
That's
are a
why
little bit.
that's why I got some weird looks when I sat down there. No.
You might be lucky at certain times of the day when they're not there yet, but usually they're very protective of their seats
Okay.
and they have their own mugs and stuff. And they always drink classic Schlenkerla. Whatever new style I introduced, they drink one and then they return to classic. So they're really kind of boring in a way, but they're so drank into their traditional Schlenkerla from the wooden barrel, of course, it's
Yeah.
really hard to move them. But this summer was like the first time I've noticed that a large portion of those regular customers would drink the Kreuzen. So
Really?
we hear from the brewers, we're kind of wondering maybe they've gotten too old now, or maybe they finally discovered that the Kreuzen is a good beer after all.
Yeah.
And so it was a really interesting move to see there. And yeah.
Whoa.
So
I
even those
mean,
people can change.
yeah. And even though, I mean, I'm sure those people sometimes, the Märzen isn't the same every time and every barrel might be different. So like, talking to those customers is always kind of cool if they're like, oh, it's good today. Or I feel like as a brewer, that's always a cool bit of information. The regulars who drink the same thing every time.
They even have an even more differentiated view at it. The mere reason why they chose that table to sit there is in order to have a direct view to the wooden barrel, and they will only order when the barrel is freshly tapped. And I
Interesting.
mean, the wooden barrels at Schlenker, they're gone in like an hour. So
Yeah.
this beer doesn't get old, it doesn't get stale, it doesn't get warm, nothing. It's
Wow.
just that we were talking 50-liter barrels here,
Yeah.
that the liquid pressure, of course, diminishes over the time while you're pouring. So at
Hmm.
the beginning, it's a little bit more carbonated, and the end a little bit less, just by the pressure of the barrel and how it
Yep.
is.
Yeah.
So, and every barrel is, of course, a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And so the regulars, they swear on just the first beers from the barrel, and then they wait till the
Interesting.
next barrel come up. Yeah. And some of them also claim they can taste what barrel it comes from. I think
Yeah.
that's an exaggeration, but I'm
Yeah.
not 100% sure.
I mean, maybe the brewers at Schlenkerla or yourself could, I mean, I'm sure you have a lot of barrels, but you,
Yeah, it's like 200 to 300, something like that.
yeah, I'm sure you have a favorite barrel in there, or this is one of the good ones. No.
Um, I have it from a pouring point of view because
Ah,
some of these barrels are real, sorry to say that, real bitches. And
yes.
you have to be careful with the handle and so forth. And you know that by the numbers and by the shape of it. So every barrel really is different. The smaller ones are all
Yeah.
easygoing, but the big ones can be tricky. And it also
Yeah.
depends when they were shipped down from the brewery, how long they've been sitting in the
Yes.
storage in the tavern, which
Yes.
at most is like a week or so, but still
Yeah.
1 or 2 days make a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they sit at eight degree. Do you have like a cooler of 8 degrees
Yeah.
or yeah, that's cool.
It's actually at 6 degrees,
Okay.
in order to give 1 degree buffer for the
Yeah.
serving. Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. All
Yeah.
right. Well, I think we're halfway through. I think this is a good, and I know we've been holding out for the listeners. We're gonna get to the true soul of Schlenkerla in the second half, and that's the smoked malt and the essence of the smoked beer. And so we're gonna take a short break now for this message, and then come right back for more of this conversation with Matthias Trum of Schlenkerla.
Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malteurop Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. First Tea is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. First Tea has ginger for the gingerbread stout, or try a porter or brown ale with ginger, vanilla, and cinnamon. Looking for other seasonal ideas? You can find out more about First Tea's collaborations with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttea.com/blog. That's FIRSTTEA.com/blog.
All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts.
Welcome back to our conversation with Matthias Trum of Schlenkerla. So I know we hit on some family stuff and some historical stuff in the first half, but now I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more about the nitty gritty of smoked malt and Schlenkerla malt. And I know it's probably a basic for you, but can you give us a tiny little walkthrough of your malting process at Schlenkerla from harvest day at the farm to brew day? Because it's still kind of a mystery for me because it's a very traditional idiosyncratic method, you know.
I'm a little bit reluctant to go too much into detail
Gotcha.
because there's a lot of family history behind it, and there's a lot of people out there who are trying to copy us.
Okay.
So we're a little bit careful, but we can, of course, talk about all the principles.
Yes.
So we don't grow the barley ourselves, like we don't run a farm or something. And in fact, we don't even have direct contracts with farmers, simply because we think it's too risky to go to just one farmer, and especially now with climate change.
Yeah.
The Bamberg area, Franconia, has become more and more dry over the last decade or so.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, this year the barley harvest is 75% less that of normal years. So basically, when you have a contract with only one farmer, you run the risk of not getting any barley at all, at least not decent quality of that. So
Yeah.
already my father made the decision to go to contract dealers of barley. So we have defined qualities which we want to have with the barley, like germination energy, protein content, water content, and so forth. And we get that from, they call it Landhandel here, the BayWa. So there's an intermediate trade organization which gets the barley from the farmers and then passes it on to us. We in fact do that through one of the malting companies here in town, the Bamberg Malting Company. They do that for us, and also another malting company up in Kulmbach, simply because these big companies have a much better access to the barley market and ensure that we get a good quality. And then the steeping is pretty standard, as you know it in all the other maltings. And the germination boxes, we're actually getting renovated at the moment, or we're getting new ones.
Wow.
This is going to be a very interesting thing. So they're planned to get in operation next year, January, so roughly in a month.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually moved those germination boxes to our historic rock cellars,
Wow.
because for until now we were like in another room which was insulated and cooled and were standard germination boxes as you know them from normal malt houses, only much smaller, 4 tons to the batch in our case, whereas in the big malt houses you have 400, 500 tons, something like that, but normal ventilation system. But now the ones in the rock cellars, they're going to be much larger in surface. And historically, and I found this again in the old records of my ancestors, historically, they would do floor malting in the rock cellars. And at 8 degrees Celsius, of course, you had an optimal temperature down there, and you had a very good control of the germination process, and it would not run wild because the barley gets too warm. So what we actually did was we're getting specialized constructed germination boxes for us, which have a very large surface, and we have a very thin layer of barley. So normally in a modern malt house, you're 1.50 meters, 2 meters in height, and you need a lot of ventilation in order to make sure that the grain does not suffocate inside. We're going to work with layers of 30 to 40 centimeters, which is very close to floor malting.
Yeah.
But we're going to have automated turning system, because obviously nowadays you don't find staff anymore that shuffles 4 or 5 tons twice a day. So it's going to be the historic floor malting process twitched by a modern technology. That really is the idea behind it, to get even more historic in the malting process. So that's the germination part. Apart from that, it's a standard germination about 1 week. And we look at all these quality items similar to regular maltings, like the protein contents and how long the seedling should be. And that, of course, you have a very homogenic malt. So that's all kind of the same thing. We're trying to get old barley types, not the really modern ones, which are aimed at maximum efficiency and maximum output. Of course, you don't get historic barley from 200 years ago. That doesn't work anymore. But there's some historic styles you can use, which are also used by some other breweries in Germany, because obviously we're too small to have one producer just for us. So that's the part of the malting. And then, of course, comes the kilning, which is what Schlenkerla really is about. And we still have an open fire kiln. Well, for I don't know how many centuries, in a long time. So you have I'm actually lacking the English words, the horde, where you put the green mold on, and underneath there's a fireplace, like from your home fireplace in your house. And then we put long beechwood logs inside, about 1 meter length. So beechwood is the standard wood with which we dry our malt. And the heat from that fire, and as a side effect, the smoke, they go into the malt and they dry the malt. In the normal way as you do it, like the temperature effect, like it's the same effect as you have in a normal malting. So at first, the moisture is driven out for a couple of hours until you have the breakthrough, and then the temperature rises up. And that's what we do, and we just have the different fuel source, if you will. And the regular Schlenkerla malt is kilned at relatively high temperature. So we go above 100 degrees Celsius. So it's not like a Pilsner malt. So we really go high up with the temperature. So the dark color of Schlenkerla also comes from that kilning process.
I've always thought it was interesting that, like, you can quantify moisture or whatever, but you can't quantify smoke character, right?
No, it doesn't work. In fact, I mean, that's the thing that changed in the last 50, 60 years. Originally, of course, you would dry the malt, and you dried it until a certain point when the moisture was there. There was something they called the boot test. So you would walk into the kiln, and depending on how far you sink in with your boots, you know how far the malting process was gone. Because of course, back then you did not have a moisture measurement or something like that. And today, of course, that runs over a time scale, and you know how long it's going to take, and stuff like that. But nowadays, you can, of course, measure the smokiness inside the malt, which is phenols. Water fluent phenols. And it actually turned out that the phenols are quite different between batches, just because it's this manual process, and you cannot adjust it to a certain point of view. It depends on how cold it is outside, what moisture you have in the air outside, the wood. Even within the same batch of wood, it might be differently, whether you have more outer pieces of the tree or more inner pieces. So there's a certain variance in there. And what my ancestors started at one point was to basically blend malts between batches in order to level that out, and in order to make sure that you have a constant flavor in the beer. So that really is the one thing. I mean, that's no secret. Most brewers do that
Yeah.
when they have a regular beer, which is like their main beer.
Yeah.
So we have that blending in there. On the other hand, in my time, I have introduced a few new smoke beers and smoke malts for that matter.
Yes.
So we started in 2009 with the oak smoke.
Yeah.
The malt which is kilned with an oak fire. I found in old records that oak was often used for kilning malt, especially in England. Apparently
Yeah.
in England it was common until the 15th, 16th century.
Yeah.
And we just made a trial run and looked and wanted to see what's going to happen flavor-wise. And my expectation before the first trial run was that the smoke would be more intense, because you think of oak as this really sturdy, strong, hard type of tree, wood, long-lasting tree, and you think, oh, intense smoke. And so I expected this to be a more intense beer. When we had the malt, we then realized it's much smoother in the smokiness than the beech. So the beech is actually the intenser version.
Yeah.
So then the question was what to do with this really mellow and smooth smoke malt. And my idea, and that's what we did in the end, was to turn it into a double bock, where you have that rich malt flavor to accompany the smokiness. And so the Schlenkerla Oak Smoke was born, which we now have for like 14 years.
Yeah.
And this year we added 2 more beers in
Yes,
that line.
I was gonna ask you about this. Very
Okay.
new exciting beers, right? Yeah, with new
With new smoke malts.
with new smoke. Yeah, so this is a creative for you, but still throwing it back to tradition. Yeah, tell us about the 2 new beers and your experience kind of brewing these for the first time and your reactions and all that.
Well, I know that in the United States, a lot of home brewers and also small brewers experiment with different types of wood, like they flavor the malt in their home smokers and stuff like that. So I didn't want to copy any of this. So my
Yeah.
idea really was to at first look what was historically done. And one of the beers we introduced is a black beer with an alder smoked or alder kilned malt.
Cool.
And alder is in fact mentioned in the book of the 1800s, where it says that alder is very favorable for the maltster because it burns for a long time. So you don't have to get up as often at night in order to refire your kiln, and you keep it longer running. So this was apparently a favorite favorite wood for malt making. And
Cool.
I just a couple of weeks ago, I talked to someone from Finland, and he said, yeah, in Finland, alderwood is the tree they use for firing their saunas.
Yeah.
Same thing up there. So up there you smoke people, and here you smoke malt. So
and you don't have to get up too much.
Exactly. That's it. I think a tree like beech is not very often available in Finland from all the climate situation, whereas they have a lot of alder. Obviously, people would use whatever wood they had locally available.
Yes.
And the thing with the Weichsel, that's the other beer we introduced this year. It's a red lager, and Weichsel is the German word for cherry tree.
Cool.
So this one is made with a cherry wood smoke malt. And for that, it did not have a historic precedence, I admit that. But I just wanted to explore what's going to happen flavor-wise when we use a fruit tree. And it actually turns out that it has a certain fruity aroma to it, not like a cherry, of course.
Yeah.
But you get a hint of fruitiness into that beer, which really goes nicely with the red lager. And the red lager, of course, a historic beer style here of Franconia, and in particular of Nuremberg.
Yeah. So, and then the alder, like, what were your reactions to the alder black beer? Like, what did you notice about? I haven't had it yet, so.
Okay, so we have to get you some, definitely.
Yes, I'm thirsty talking about all the smoke beer.
Well, our US importer has it. I have to talk to him that he gets you a couple of bottles over.
Nice.
The Alder is basically the little brother of the classic Märzen smoke beer. So the Alder has a relatively, well, of course, a very dark color, black beer. We have roast malt in there, so you have a lot of roast aromas and a very smooth but also intense smoky aroma and flavor, but not as harsh as in the classic Märzen. So it's a little more a little bit smoother on that end, and it really nice balances with the roast aromas from the roast malt. And the Weichsel, on the other hand, the red lager, that's like, as in Germany, we call it eine ganz andere Baustelle, a totally different construction site. It's not comparable in flavor to the classic Märzen smoked beer. It's much less smoky, even though we have like 80% Weichsel smoke malt in there. But it's really subtle on the smokiness, and it's more comes from the fruity side and has more fruity aromas.
Cool.
And that mellowness, which you know from red lagers. So I think for all the people for whom the classic Schlenkerla is too intense and too much, the Weichsel is a really, really good alternative.
Cool.
And the black lager is for Schlenkerla lovers. It's really
nice.
a Schlenkerla treat.
Nice. That sounds right up my alley. I wanted to maybe touch on some like brewing QC. Obviously, your malt is very special, and you're brewing potentially a more vintage way compared to a lot of other modern Bavarian or breweries. How has like your fermentations and your QC kind of like remain the same over the past couple hundred years, and how has it changed? How has it modernized? I'm sure it has a little bit, but can you speak to your QC quality control process?
I was going to ask, but I figured
Yes.
it was quality
Yes.
control. Yeah. That of course changed a lot. I mean, you have so much more possibilities these days in order to do quality control. It starts with the raw material, which is supplied with an analysis sheet, so you know where you start from. We in fact have a small laboratory at our brewery. I mean, we're roughly a 20,000 hectoliter, meaning 20,000 barrel brewery, and we have our own laboratory, which at least here in Germany, I don't know about the United States, but in Germany, that's quite uncommon. Usually breweries are much bigger until they have a laboratory, but quality is very important to us. And we have our own yeast propagation unit. We got that, or I got that roughly 7 years ago. Because I wanted to concentrate even more there on the optimal state of the yeast when you start the fermentation, because as you know, a quick fermentation at the beginning is the essence for not getting any infections into the beer and for having a good final flavor, of course. The other thing where we invested a lot of money in the last 15 years was in the extension of our lagering facilities. We were talking about the rock cellars before, and in the old days, there were wooden barrels down there for lagering. And in the 1920s, Michael replaced them by iron vessels, which was the thing at the time. My father, after World War II, he replaced them by aluminum vessels.
Okay.
And by the time I took over, they were, getting close to the end of their life cycle, because they get rough on the inside because of the CO2, which of course is a breeding ground for bacteria. So I made the decision to replace everything by stainless steel, together here with Kaspar Schulz of Bamberg. Kaspar Schulz, oldest brewery machine factory in the world, which probably most of the listeners know as well. And this was quite a challenge, because getting those modern large scale vessels into the historic rock cellars through a small shaft. I don't think a lot of companies could have done that. They actually did a CAD model on the computer and simulated how they would bring those vessels into there.
Wow.
So they came in there in one piece rather than being welded on spot.
Yeah. Wow.
Which I wanted, because when you weld on spot, your welding is not going to be as smooth, which again might be a problem with infection and so forth.
Yes.
So to make a long story short, we now have capacity for 100 batches in our rock cellars. And we have a maturation time for all the classic Schlenkerla of 2 to 3 months. and all the
Yeah.
bock beers get half a year of maturation.
Wow. That's
And
so
that
cool.
and that by itself pushes quality a certain point upwards. And for instance, the bock beers, we don't need to filter them anymore because they clean by themselves, and that by itself gets a huge aroma boost. And at least the draft ones.
Yeah.
With the bottled ones, it's sometimes a bit different because you have to be sturdy on that one. But um, so uh, I was talking early on, profit maximization is not a thing for us. So we invested a lot of money into that quality into there. It's gotten to a point where when we got the last how's that IRS exam, when like the tax officials control your books and everything,
Yeah.
they were saying that we're over invested compared to what we're producing, what we're doing. And I explained to the assessor how we see quality and what we do in there and everything. And then he kind of said, okay, he's willing to accept that. And he's not assuming anything else, which of course there's not. And so even on a balance scorecard level, this shows what we're doing on that end. And my tax attorney always says we're crazy what we're doing, but I just like it that way.
Yeah.
And so
Compared
that's
to
a big thing.
compared to other breweries.
Compared to other businesses,
Yeah,
yes.
I
But
gotcha.
but there again comes the family into play. And my father supports me on that, and he doesn't pull money out of the business in like, driving expensive cars or having a house on Mallorca or something like that, which maybe in other companies people do. So we always stay invested and keep it on that maximum level. And of course, when you run a place that is stock owned, or you have shareholders which you have to pay a certain rate out, then you cannot do that. But within the family, when you all pull in the same direction, when you stay together and we say, hey, we do it that way, and this is not only our business, this is our hobby.
Yeah.
And every day you go to the tavern, every day you go to the brewery, you enjoy those tanks in the rock cellars. That's a
Yeah.
value by itself. And so that's kind of the way we did it. So I have my Porsche down there, so to say, yeah, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's filled with beer,
Yeah.
and yeah, that it's really my hobby, and I live it. And my wife kind of complains that I don't have any other hobbies, but okay, that's one thing she has to live with.
Yeah.
We're sitting here on a Sunday talking about this, so I think
Yeah.
even that shows it.
Totally.
And so that's where we come from a quality point of view. And I hired a brewmaster for the laboratory, so we
Hmm.
put a lot of effort in that one as well. And whenever we do new beers, we do a lot of experimentation until we get the final taste. If quality is not what we wanted, we throw it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't do trial batches on small scale. We always start with a large scale because we want to have it 100% how it is later on in the
Mhm.
actual production.
Yeah.
So yeah, quality is next to history the most important thing here at Schlenkerla.
Yeah. And then so like in your father's time, for example, the fermentations, like what was the yeast like and how is he handling yeast? And like you were theoretically drinking those beers when you were a late teenager.
Early teenager.
Early teenager. Yeah, there you
You're
go.
talking Germany. It's a little bit
Yeah.
more easygoing here than in the States.
Yes, I believe that. Like how has what was the yeast? Yeah, I'm just curious about like the evolution in the past 1 or 200 years about like yeast handling and flavor, and then like making investments and saying like, wow, like all right, yeah, like I know you said you made the bought the propagator and you have a cute a lab guy now, but yeah, like what was that evolved from?
Um, I think back then at my father's time, the yeast management was not that important. And from a flavor point of view, I still think that yeast management in the smoke beer is not as important as, say, in a lager or a pilsner,
Yeah.
because the smoke is such a dominant smoke flavor, and there is no Schlenkerla yeast. We never went to a way where we said we want to have our own yeast type, other than I was working, for instance, at the Urge brewery in Düsseldorf, Altbier, and they have their Urge yeast, which everything revolves around. And
Yeah.
I know other breweries do the same thing. I think was it Beck's Brewery that even sent yeast to space to kind of
I don't know.
So stuff like that. It never played that important a role here at Schlenkerla. In fact, we get the yeast from befriended breweries.
Yeah.
And we don't always need the exact same yeast type. So when we talk about getting our own propagation and having the laboratory, it's all about optimal fermentation and not getting infection in that. But it's not about, hey, Schlenkerla needs yeast number 4072 instead of 465, because that's going to change the flavor.
Interesting.
For that, the smoke flavor is too intense.
Yes.
That's not necessary on that end. No.
Yeah.
So what my father did was he switched from the open vat fermenters to the closed fermenters. So that was one of his contributions. He did a lot of contributions, but that was on the quality level a very important one, because obviously you decrease your risk of infections enormously.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. And then in terms of barley, you mentioned before different varieties of barley, trying to find some different some heirloom varieties or some older, more maybe tastier. Yeah, what has that looked like throughout the past, the more recent history? Because I'm sure some have gone away, some became harder to get, and like that you're having to source that, and because the malt is kind of the heart and soul of your beer. Can you any comments on that?
Well, that's the thing why my father decided a long time ago to actually move to a trade company in between, because it gave him more flexibility in that respect. Because when you talk to a farmer and you tell him, hey, grow that barley, and he says, I don't know how to handle that. I don't know how to fertilize it. I don't know. Yeah. And then we would have to come up with that. This is outside our expertise. This is something we do not know. And at least as long as I have the family records, we've never grown our own barley. 100 years ago, we grew our own hops actually, but we've never grown our own barley. So this is actually one thing we kind of outsource. So we get from our tradespeople what barley they have available, and then we kind of research and we look at the values, and we also get advices on who else might use it for historic beer styles and that, but we're dependent on the supplier on that one.
Yeah.
I admit that.
Cool. And one other thing I wanted to kind of plug and get you to extrapolate on is your thesis paper for your studies at Weihenstephan on I read, I think, most of it last night.
Wow.
well, I think
that's why you look so tired now.
Yeah.
Okay. Just kidding.
But yeah, I wanted to kind of just get your comments on that. I'm sure there were some like aha moments during so if you could tell the listeners about the crux of that thesis, and then like if you took any of that to Schlenkerla, and if you had any like, oh my God, like earth-shattering moments from studying that beer history.
I have to say how the whole thing started. Usually when you go to Weihenstephan and you study brewing science and you do your diploma works, you do it on some technical aspect, like whatever, water purification and so forth. That was not my line of things, and I could have done that, but I don't think I would have been very good at it. And we also had brewing history down there, and I very much liked the Professor Moisdorfer. He died, unfortunately, a couple of years ago. And he came in one day, or I told him I want to do a thesis, and he was thrilled because I was like the first one in years to do a brewing history thesis, because, as I said, most brewers are more these technical oriented people. And so he said, yeah, he has to think about it, but he has a couple of topics which he liked to explore. And so he came back a couple of weeks later. And he showed me a picture which I knew, that oldest depiction of a brewer, the Bierbrew Hattel. It shows a brewer in a monk a suit, basically. He's steering in, not staring, he's steering in a kettle.
Yeah.
Obviously with brewing beer, you have a fire
Yeah.
underneath, and over him, hovering or hanging on a stick, is the brewing star,
Yeah.
which is a hexagram and looks like the Star of David, like the Jewish star. And then he presents me with another picture, exactly the same posture, same guy, also steering, a little bit different looking, but obviously from the same painter. Only the symbol was different. It was not a brewing star, but it was rather like a fence. It looked a little bit like a fence. And he said he found this other picture, and the one was a brewmaster and the other one was a brewer, and he couldn't make heads or tails of it. The brewing star, we know, it's a symbol of the Brewers Guild, and it's you find it very often in taverns here in the area on the antler outside.
Yeah.
The Schlenkler Tavern has it outside.
Yeah.
And there's the Zeugel beer in Oberpfalz, which is homebrewed beer, which also has that symbol on it.
Yeah.
But nobody ever saw that fence-like structure. And he could only direct me to, this must have to do something with the city of Nuremberg and the house the house book of the Mendel family. So I started with this riddle, basically, and then started going through the archives, and it took me about 3 months of research in various books, in various archives, and in the end it turned out that these depictions are basically from the same house book. So basically this house was like an old age home for craft people that could not afford their own living anymore. And this was a donation by a rich family, a foundation. And from that donation, 12 of these craft people could always live together, like the 12 apostles.
Wow.
And this started in the 14th century. And it was only for craft people. And they had a house book in which all the members over the centuries were depicted, and the name and the profession was underneath. And the special thing is that all these craftspeople were depicted with their tools. So this book is a unique look into the history of craft and what kind of tools were used for the various professions. And there's a number of brewers in there. And Bierbrew Hattel just happens to be the oldest one. He was, in fact, there before the 14th century, before the 15th century. But the depiction was made in 1425 because the book was started a couple of decades after the foundation started. And that also explains why the first 20 or so members look the same, because the guy who painted those paintings never saw these people. Yeah, he just had to imagine what they have looked like. And the gown they were wearing was not a monk suit or something like that, because this was not a monastery. This was just the institution gown, which everybody of them was wearing. So very often when you see this picture, it says it shows the historic monks and how they were brewing beer, and that's false. So that was my first aha moment. Yeah, all these publications out there, and they got it wrong, and I got it right. Yes. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that fence kind of like image. So the question was, where did that come from? I found a number of clues, but not the final proof. Apparently, this kind of fence was used in the area of Nuremberg often to depict houses in which freshly brewed beer is being served. More on a communal level, not on a commercial level. And in the course, I built up a theory which I could not finally prove. Excuse me. One of the patrons of brewing is the Holy Florian. a martyr from the Roman times, a Catholic martyr.
Mhm.
And Florian was actually, well, as martyrs are, he was murdered by the Romans, and they grilled him to death on like a barbecue. And that's why
Ah,
he's always depicted with that kind of a grid.
ah,
And you find him also, or he's also the patron of firefighters, because he
interesting.
was on that grill. And so
Yeah,
grill, fire, that's the connection.
yeah,
And breweries always had the problem of running a big fire hazard,
yes,
not only the maltings for the smoke vault, but also the brewery itself.
yeah,
So in a number of cities, you find that the Holy Florian was the patron of the brewers, because firefighters, brewers, it was always
hmm,
the same.
yeah,
And in that same context, you can interpret the brewing star. The brewing star, back to antique times, was a protective symbol being etched into doors and doorsteps of houses in order to protect the houses from bad mishaps, from fire and stuff like that. You find it on little amulets which people would carry when they would travel.
hmm,
You in fact find it in combination with barley on symbols to
hmm,
maybe protect the harvest and stuff like that.
yeah,
So both of these have this protective kind of background meaning to it. And I think that's the reason why you find both in those depictions, because brewers, I mean, they were a little bit, what's the English word for that? Abergläubig. They thought of demons, and that could
oh, yes,
not religious, but
uh,
when a black cat crosses your street,
yeah,
you're being wary and stuff. So I think all the people in the Middle Ages were like that to a certain extent. So
yes,
having a protective sign over your house, especially when you're making beer, was a very important thing. I mean, back then people would think, when beer turned sour, that demons might have had an influence in it, or beer
yeah,
witches and stuff like that. So
yes,
belief played a certain amount, a certain role in it. And I think that's part of the reason why these symbols are being used, or were being used. So that's this part of the story.
yeah,
The second aha moment was the brewing star itself, that hexagram. You find this very often in around alchemy. So it's an
yeah,
alchemy symbol. And now I come back to my family story. I grew up above the tavern, as I told you earlier on. And when you do a city tour of Bamberg, the sightseeings, you will make a stop in front of Schlenkerla, and people will, the guide will tell you about smoke beer and so forth. And they always talked about the brewing star in our antler. And they always said this is a sign of alchemy, symbolizing like two triangles overlapping each other. And the two triangles symbolize water and fire, which you use in alchemy. And of course, you use that in making beer.
hmm,
So brewers are essentially alchemists turning water into beer,
hmm,
whereas the alchemist wants to turn anything into gold. Yeah, so that was the
yeah,
story behind it. And I always thought this was a little bit weird in a way. I mean, alchemy was regarded, well, not too with too high esteem. Those were, like all close to witches and magicians. Yeah, so these
yeah,
were not in regular, not the big respected members of the community.
yeah,
Beer, however, was nutrition.
yeah,
Make Brewing beer, baking bread, those were the core businesses of the
yeah,
time, because it was
essential.
absolutely essential. Exactly. And well, for that reason, it did not make sense that these two groups would use the same symbol. And when you come from that protective point of view, that this was an amulet, you could actually say, hey, it makes sense. Brewers used it not because of alchemy, but they used it in order to have a protection for their house. And maybe even the alchemists used it in that context because they were brewing around. And only later on, somebody interpreted that yin and yang, water and fire and so forth
Yeah,
into it. I don't think people thought like that back then
mm,
in that way. And so that was the second aha effect.
yeah,
Everybody out there says it's alchemy, and hey, I know it's something different.
yeah,
So I've actually started to give presentations to the Bamberg tourist guides in order to educate them on
yeah,
that, so they can tell the real story of the brewing star.
yes. Awesome.
And the third aha moment, and the obvious question was, is there any connection to the Star of David, to the Jewish star?
Mhm.
Which at first you would say no, it's two different things.
Yeah.
But if you look at the history of the Star of David, there is some proximity, if you want to put it that way. The Star of David originated not in the historic antique times with David on the shield and so forth. That's a modern interpretation. There's no actual proof of that. The
Mhm.
historic sign of the Jewish community was the menorah, the chandelier with the
Mhm.
seven points, and the Star of David only became relevant through the Zionistic movement in the 19th century, and then, of course, later on in the Holocaust. But it started as a Jewish symbol in the community of Prague, sometimes in the 15th, 16th century. Jewish people in medieval Europe or in Europe at the time were usually living in their own city quarter, separated from the rest. And cities usually had city walls around them, which had to be mounted and defended when the city was attacked. So the Jewish had their own militia and their own gate in that city wall normally, which they were defending. And the Jewish community of Prague had the six-pointed star on their flag. And because Prague was a center of Jewish book printing, and in those books they would use that symbol as well, these books spread out all over Europe, and it's perceived that because of that, eventually it turned into that general Jewish symbol in the Zionistic movement. And now the interesting thing, the Jews of Prague originally came from Nuremberg. They were expelled from Nuremberg in the 14th century because there was a pogrom there. So there must have been Nuremberg influence on the Prague community big time. And as I said earlier on, Franconia and Bohemia, Nuremberg is Franconia, Bamberg is Franconia, Prague, of course, is Bohemia.
Yeah, very
This is
close.
this is a cultural connection. I mean, from the distance, it's like when you drive from New York to Washington, something like that. So it's relatively close.
Yeah.
And so my assumption or my speculation is that the six-pointed star was a general protective symbol, protecting your houses against fire, against demons in your beer, or any type of, a good sign, a good sign for you and your life in your house.
Yeah.
And in that context, the Jewish community from Nuremberg took it with them over to Prague, then used it on their flag 200 years later. And from there, in the course of the next couple of hundred years, over the Zionistic movement, it became that Jewish symbol it is today, that religious symbol. So in fact, it has that historic protective idea in a way. And when you look at the interpretation with the Magen David, with the shield of David, David against Goliath, of course, that story, again, you have that protective story in there. So there is a certain proximity between the meaning for the brewer and the original meaning for the Jewish community.
Man, so it seems like you have more research to do. At the end, I know there's more questions, even though you unturn a lot of info, there's always more questions.
It will be hard to prove something like that eventually. I was contacted a couple of years ago by a professor from the University of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And he was quite interested in that, and we did like a little presentation and stuff together.
Cool.
But of course, with any religious topic, you have to be extremely careful because you're going to hurt feelings of people and stuff like that. So I'm really kind of laid back. And 4 years ago, there was an exhibition at the Jewish Museum of Munich, which revolved around Jewish involvement in the brewing industry, which in the 1900s was quite intense. Same here in Bamberg, because Jewish people were very often active in trade because they could not do craft. Yeah, they usually were prohibited from doing craft, but they could do trade. And since there was Jewish communities all over Europe, and they all had the same language, they had a certain advantage in trading. And a lot of hop trading was done by Jews. And when in the 19th
Interesting.
century, free trade came up and Jews were allowed to invest into all kinds of businesses, a lot of the newly found industry breweries in Germany at the late 19th century were in fact invested by Jewish families. And of course, that was revolved back during Nazi time when they were expelled and their shares were taking off. But a lot of big German breweries were run by or owned by Jewish families around the 1900s.
Man, beer history.
Oh yeah.
I'm into it, and I know I'd love to visit you at Schlenkerla and talk more, and next time I'm there about and dig into some other things. But I want to wrap up the podcast with kind of where we started, the next generation for Schlenkerla. How many kids do you have, and how old are they, and like what's their involvement? What's the next generation shaping up to be like?
Well, I have two kids. My son Julius, he's 12, and my daughter Felicia, she's 9. So very far away still from taking responsibility. And Julius always says he's going to take over, and I can retire and have a fun time and so forth. We will see what puberty does about that. And Felicia, at the moment, she wants to do something with animals. I think I just have to convey to her that yeast is a type of animal too. So maybe that works in that respect as well.
This is true.
So yeah, we will see how that goes. But I think there's definitely some form of interest there. And I'm trying to convey them the rich family history, not too much because I don't want to bore them, of course.
Yeah. And if you force it, then they'll.
No,
I feel like
work.
with kids, sometimes it's like you force it and then they pull back.
No, my parents didn't force it on me at all. They always I'm a single child, so I was the only option they had.
Yeah.
But they always said, if you want to do something else, okay, but be sure that you really like to do the other thing. And for me, it never was a question to do anything else. And I mean, when I look at my kids, Julius, when I had my 40th birthday, Julius was 4 years at the time, so he walked over to the wooden barrel, started pouring the beer and serving the guests of the festival or of the party. So I said, hey, there's my successor right there. Of course, Felicia came afterwards, so now it's an open race, but he's definitely into it. And as you pointed out earlier, being a teenager from a brewery gives you certain advantage within the class and with your friends and so forth. So it's the cool thing. It's really the cool thing.
Wow, that's I bet. Yeah, our kids we'll see, but our brewery has no heritage, but I do pride myself on being a family brewer and trying to keep it close to home. So
starting a family brewery, I think, is much more difficult than continuing it. So you're doing a big thing here.
Well, you have provided a very good inspiration, and I hope to make it out to Bamberg at some point very soon.
You're welcome anytime, and we have a beer together and chat some more.
Yes, and on that note, I'd like to conclude the podcast. Thank you very much, Matthias, for agreeing to chat with me today. And
thank you very much for having me, and thank you for your patience. I know history is not always the easiest topic.
I love it. I'm literally it's one of the things that excites me when you get too bogged down in the day to day. Oh yes, the yeast, the barley, ferment the beer. The history and connecting the dots is something that kind of reinvigorates my passion, I think. So thank you for being so dedicated to that.
Gladly done. Thank you.
Okay. Matthias will be back on the next episode of this show as the host, having a conversation with a brewer of his choosing. That will be on the air in 2 weeks, so make sure you tune in for that. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media. To support journalism in the beer space, check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. I'm Dan Suarez of Suarez Family Brewery. Thank you for listening to the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Cheers.
First Tea is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. Falling temps and festive seasons are fast approaching, which means now is a good time to develop holiday stouts and brown ales using hibiscus and cinnamon from First Tea. Looking for other new ideas? You can find out more about First Tea's collaborations with brewers and tea ingredients by visiting firsttea.com/blog. That's FIRSDTEA.com/blog. Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, Malteurop Malting Company's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe Malting Company can support your malting needs. Contact Malt Europe Malting Company at customersuccess@malteurope.com or dial 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order.